Hello, everyone, and good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. And welcome to another episode of the Writers Hub here on Tales from the Wandering Scribe. I'm your host, Gabriel Garcia. Maybe you know me as the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill. And joining us today is another Wandering Scribe alumni. Now, if you remember this guest, she is a talented author, an amazing individual. She is also the person that got me involved with the California Writers Group here in Orange County. She is exceptionally talented. And if you remember my initial discussion with her, we were talking about her book, Haggard House, which, reading this, viewers and listeners, it really messed with me. It was the most psychologically enthralling, engaging, immersive, and damaging book I have ever read. But this has been such an amazing book. She is incredibly talented, an amazing person. She has done a lot for the California Writers Club. She is one of its highest ranking members. And in today's episode, we're going to be talking about emotional writing, keeping the reader engaged and involved. And what better guest to have on the show to discuss this topic than my good friend, fellow California Writers Club member, Elisabeth Rhoads. Elisabeth, welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Gabriel. I'm very excited to be back on the show. I had a great experience my first time around. You're such a great interviewer and so easy to talk to. And thank you for the very kind introduction of both me and my book. You're more than generous.
You're welcome, Elizabeth. You're welcome. Now, before we begin today's discussion, would you like to share with our viewers and listeners a little update with you since the last time you were on the show?
Yeah, absolutely. So the last time I was on the show, I was actually running the book, which you just mentioned, Haggard House. I still haven't figured out how to mirror my camera, so it's backwards on mine. But I was running that as a serial at the time, a serialized novel, releasing it a couple chapters every week on Substack. I did that over the course of a year. It was a really great learning experience. It was a lot of fun. And I was able to build up a little bit of an audience that way. And since that time, I've, as you already mentioned, published the book. I have gotten some really generous reviews for it, including a trade review from Forward Reviews. It was an editor's pick with Forward Reviews, so that was really exciting to get that. So yeah, I'm on the other side of publication now, so it's kind of a different part of the journey, but a lot of learning went on in between, and I'm very happy to be here.
Nice, nice. And also just want to add one more thing, viewers and listeners, that Elizabeth was also on a book tour promoting Haggard House, and I had the opportunity to attend her launch party at Arvida Books, which was amazing. If you have not gone to Arvida Bookstore in Tustin, I highly recommend checking it out. It's a really cool bookstore, really amazing place. And again, going back to Haggard House, that was a book did not know what to expect upon reading it, because I typically don't read a lot of psychological thrillers, but this one was the very first one that really, really grabbed my attention emotionally. And it's really cool that we are using this as a starting point to discuss this topic of keeping the reader emotionally involved and engaged. So let's start that little icebreaker, Elizabeth. So as you were writing like Haggard House, how did you really decide upon the emotions, or what were ultimately the emotions you wanted readers to experience from this book?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. I think when you start writing a novel, or at least I can say for myself, when I started writing the novel, I had kind of a very vague or general idea of how I wanted readers to feel, a little bit scared. Obviously, there's like a little bit of, I would say, horror kind of subgenre or undertones in the novel. And I think that was kind of the main thing going through the first draft. And, a first draft, or at least my first draft, was kind of messy. It didn't really have a great story arc. It didn't really have a great emotional arc. And in going back to edit and revise that, I started thinking more about how do I want the readers to feel about these characters that are in the story, because I did really like the characters, and they were coming across a little bit flat. Adam, the protagonist, he really struggles with ideas and beliefs that he was taught growing up, and he has a lot of struggles with, are these things true? And he, as a child, he was kind of made to do certain things that went along with these beliefs. But as he grows up, he starts to question those and question the ideas and think, are these really good things? And so my job as the writer became to figure out how to portray that in a way that would make the reader not view him as a monster, because he could come across that way because of some of the things he does in the novel. Yeah. But to actually be on his side and understand why he's doing the things that he's doing. And so that a lot of that came in revision.
Yes, absolutely. And I think among the many things when it comes to fine-tuning and revising like a story, or even just writing a story, is definitely making a world immersive and engaging. And people think, well, isn't that, the standard for authors, that we want to make it? I would say definitely yes and no, in the sense that if we want to really grab the reader's emotion, that's a different mindset, because it's one thing to get the reader's attention and invest it. It's another thing to really spark an emotion from a scene or a particular moment in the story. And in Haggard House, there's quite a few that are like really, really in your face, which I absolutely love. And this kind of leads into the discussion of, showing, not telling, especially when it comes to emotions. So, Elisabeth, in your own opinion, why do you think that's probably the biggest thing for authors, showing, not telling, in the context of the emotional side of storytelling?
Yeah, so that's actually something that was brought up to me by one of my early readers, someone whose opinion I really admired and valued. She said, gave me feedback on one of the early drafts that she would suggest showing a lot more. I was doing a lot of telling, and she suggested, every chapter, every scene where you're doing all this showing, can you switch it to, or I'm sorry, I think I said that backwards. All these scenes where you're telling, can you switch it to where you're showing instead? So I really had to think about that. And I went through chapter by chapter and was just asking myself the question, how can I show this instead of telling it? If the protagonist, Adam, is feeling a certain way in a scene, I think especially the first chapter I worked on a lot. He immediately in the story has this tension. His mother has told him one thing. She's told him basically not to interact with the village children because of their religious beliefs. And he has to go through this experience of going to school and somehow having to interact with them without actually interacting with them. And so showing that became, looking at what are the emotions he's experiencing while he's going through this experience. What kind of bodily reactions is he having? What is he saying versus what is he thinking? Because it is written in first person. So I had the kind of nice aspect of being able to go into his thoughts a little bit. So that was one of the things. And I had to go through every single chapter and rewrite a lot of what I had written, because a lot of it was, and now he's doing this, and a lot of that telling. But I will say that with the caveat of I had the honor and opportunity to be in the author Richard Bausch's workshop. And one of the things that he mentioned, which I always try to keep in mind, is, he says, everyone says show, don't tell. But he said, I would say show and tell. So there is a little bit of a balance. It's obviously very good to show, but there are certain scenes and situations where you do actually just have to tell. Like if you're setting up a description of a scene, do you really want to spend 2 pages setting that up by trying to show it in some way? Or would you rather just give a paragraph of, this is what it looked like? Sometimes you need to do that. So I think you kind of have to use both, but you have to be aware of when you're using each.
Yes. And this kind of goes into the discussion of, info dumping in a scene, that you want to explain everything that's happening, but you don't want to like say this is happening. You want to show that is happening. And I've even struggled with that in my own writing. And for me, writing emotional scenes has always been a challenge for me in my own writing. The one scene that I think that I love sharing is from Michael, the Last Angel of Earth. Without spoiling too much, there is a particular scene where Michael makes a decision to protect his friends, to save his friends at the cost of his own life. The build up to that was a very like, okay, how am I going to pull this off? Because I want it to resonate. I want it to land. I want to get the same reaction. And sometimes I draw from a lot of cinematic moments in film to invoke that emotion. Sometimes it's a hit, sometimes it's a miss. But ultimately, trying to get the reader invested up to that point and have them stay invested is a very, very challenging scene. And speaking of scenes, Elisabeth, could you share with us a particular scene that was probably your favorite to write in terms of exploring emotional reactions? And what was probably the most challenging scene to write? Because I imagine there were quite a few. I think I know which ones, but I would like to hear your thoughts.
I'm curious if we think they're the same ones.
Well, we'll see.
So I think actually the most fun, it totally came out of left field, but the most fun scene, it's actually an entire chapter, but it is one scene. For me to write was the novel's told in 5 different points of view, 5 different characters narrate the story. And the mother, so I mentioned a little bit about how Adam, the protagonist, he has these interesting religious beliefs that have been passed down to him. His mother is the one that's essentially passing those beliefs on. And she's, had her own struggles and has her own ways that she came up with these ideas. But I was never planning to write a chapter from her point of view. But again, one of the feedback that I got from early drafts was that she was kind of coming across as almost witch-like, like not a real person, like kind of this stereotype evil character. And I didn't want that. I wanted her to be a more complex character. And so in going back and revising and figuring out why did she become the way that she became, I had this chapter that I wrote that came completely out of left field from her point of view. There's only one chapter from her in the entire book. And I wrote it in one sitting. I revised it very little. And it was really fun in that it was such a surprise. And it's like, that's one of the things that you enjoy as a writer is, when these things come to you and it just is so natural. It happens very rarely. But when it does happen, you really enjoy it. And so I loved writing that chapter, but I also, it was very difficult to be in her mental state. So I was also at the same time very happy when I was done writing it, because I didn't want to spend any more time in that mind. So that was probably the easiest one to write.
Nice. I definitely remember reading that chapter. I like that it was only one chapter, that it gave you enough, but not too much. And I ultimately think when we try to invoke an emotional reaction from readers, we have to do it very delicately, because we don't want to turn them away, but do like a bait and switch when it comes down to an emotional reaction in storytelling, because there are numerous books that we have read that are guilty of the bait and switch and are not really good. But yeah, as you said, Elizabeth, there's a lot of POVs in this story that definitely they make you feel certain things at certain times where you want to feel sympathy for Adam because his story among the major ones is very tragic and traumatic. But you also don't want to overly sympathize with the character because you see that he chooses sometimes to make the decisions on his own. And the one whose story I found very fascinating in terms of like the emotional reactions at this time, because almost like it is historical, because it is set in the past. And I think that's what really sells the emotion is that it's from not so distant past, set in like this community that's far away from civilization, but it's like this border town of like the primitive, not primitive, but the primal aspects and the modern aspects. And again, reading all those chapters, I was emotionally drained by the end because I was just blown away by all the emotions. And this comes down to something that I would love to hear your thoughts on, Elizabeth, which is, the edits and the revisions of the story. Because as authors, we do have to make changes when needed, but we still want to keep the emotional impact. So as you were writing this and then working with your editor, how did you guys like ensure that, the emotional reactions in certain chapters remain the same, even if the chapter or chapters may have been written differently by the end?
Mm. Yeah, so I worked with two different editors, actually. One was a developmental editor, and that was more early on in the process. I had gotten some reader feedback, but I basically had written myself to the point where I was stuck. I just thought, I don't know how to improve this. I know it needs more improvement, but I don't know how to fix it on my own. So at that point, I hired a developmental editor to work with. And I think that at that point, the story just needed so much work. It wasn't even really a matter of trying to keep those emotional arcs intact because in many cases, they didn't even exist yet. And that was part of the, revising and editing. And she would kind of question, I'm trying to think if there's a specific example. She would basically question some of the writing choices that I made. One thing that I vividly remember, which is kind of funny, something that really bothers me when I read historical fiction is when an author has clearly done a lot of research on a subject and they might spend a page or a couple of pages writing about something that doesn't necessarily have a lot of relevance to this story, but they researched it. They want you to know that they researched it with a lot of work. And so it gets into the story. So that's one of my pet peeves. And I tried very hard to avoid that myself, but I did actually fall into that trap. So I had spent quite a lot of time researching, during this time period, mid 1800s, how were they starting fires? And so I did a bunch of research about tinder boxes and, how did they get the spark? And then from the spark, how did it become a flame? And so I wrote this very long, drawn out scene about Peter, the father, starting a lamp. It was probably 3 or 4 paragraphs, and it was just full of description about exactly how he did this. And without putting any notation, without any reasoning, my developmental editor just crossed out every single line of that description. And when I saw it, I knew exactly why she did it because it didn't contribute to the story. It was just me and my, ego, like, hey, look, I did a lot of research and I want you to know that. And so that was one of the things where, it actually was taking away from the story. And those kind of things can take away from the emotional impact because you get bogged down in the details. They're not really relevant to the story. You do obviously need some details to kind of paint a picture, but those kind of things can really detract from those emotional scenes. And that was something that did later become quite an emotional scene.
Absolutely. Now, another thing I did want to talk about, Elizabeth, is techniques in writing. And there are numerous master classes that talk about techniques, whether that's writing a scene writing a transition, writing the perfect scene break. In your opinion, Elisabeth, what techniques did you use to really evoke the emotions in certain chapters that you would like to share with the viewers?
Yeah, so I think there were a couple of things. Again, going back to Richard Bausch, teacher and extraordinary writer, he would always mention clarity. One of the most important things that you need to give the reader is clarity. Make it very clear. Always be clear. And it seems very simple, but actually that keeps you from making a lot of these mistakes that can get in the way, such as writing many paragraphs about how to start a fire with a tinderbox. It helps you think about it. It shifts you from a me perspective of, my craft and my story to what is the reader actually experiencing, what's clear for the reader. It just helps you at every level. I mean, if you're thinking about the scene, is the scene clear? Can the reader picture this? That will really clarify what you're doing on the page. If you're thinking at the sentence level, is the sentence confusing when other people are reading it? Did they get what I was saying? Was it confusing? I had so many readers say this sentence didn't make any sense. And you have to think about it from their perspective. Okay, how can I make that clear? And just by making something super clear for the reader, it actually kind of solves a lot of the problems. If you always go back to clarity for the reader, it will solve a lot of the problems on its own. And of course, you have other tools in your toolbox, like dialogue, setting and context, making sure that the reader is set in the time and place, like they know where they are. But again, it goes back to clarity. So you can always kind of use that as a guidepost to help you with everything else.
Absolutely. And another thing that I wanted to talk to you about, and maybe you've also learned this in Richard Bauer's class or classes, do you think that writing scenes that are engaging and immersive to the senses also plays a factor in keeping the reader emotionally engaged? Almost like an example of horror movies. Horror movies do this really amazing thing that I've seen where they will make something that affects a certain sense. Case in point, even though it's not really it is a horror movie in the classical sense, Jaws. If you look at it as it is, it's not as terrifying. But to this day, why are people still afraid of Jaws? It's the music. The music, those little keys, set the tone and instantly invoke an emotional reaction and response. What's another good example? Jason Voorhees, the character, his breathing. That little ha 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 ha. That was probably a bad version, viewers and listeners, but the reaction when you hear that, something bad is going to happen. So, Elisabeth, do you think there is a connection between writing a scene that is targeting a specific sense that in turn invokes a certain emotional response?
Yes, definitely. You can certainly use scene and setting and context to create a kind of a certain, I don't know if I think it can create an emotion itself, but it's just almost like the backdrop. If you think about a photograph and you're getting a photograph, if you have like a beach backdrop, you're getting a different emotion than if you have, I don't know, like a city backdrop. Like one might feel, you have the beach and you might instantly feel calm, or you have the city and maybe you feel something else. If you live in a city and you love them, maybe you'll feel calm too. But it could be, like a little bit, it could be a business feeling or something else. So it can give you, I would say, kind of a broad picture emotion. But that's just a backdrop. It's, you always have to layer on top of that the things that are actually in the story. But I think it's very effective in setting the background. And it's certainly something that I used in Haggard House. I mean, you have Haggard House, actually, the title comes from a real house that Adam lives in. And that house is a very spooky, dark, it almost has its own personality, kind of gothic vibe. And that helps, set the tone for the story, in addition to all of the things that are happening on top of it, the more specific strokes.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And since this is the month of Halloween and we are on All Hallows Eve later on tonight, there was something I did want to ask you, Elizabeth, in terms of what you said, like, the Gothic house, and in terms of Gothic literature. Haggard House is a psychological thriller that messes with your mind, which it absolutely does to perfection. And as you've seen, I don't read a lot of like horror-based or psychological thriller books, but I imagine like each book, depending on what genre you're writing in, wants to invoke a certain emotion. I actually had an interview with a guest earlier in the year, Samantha Fisher, who writes a more gothic literature style of books that reading it, you can definitely tell, okay, the language is very different as opposed to a psychological thriller. Do you think that in terms of like the different genres between a psychological thriller book and a gothic literature book, the writing also dictates the emotions that you want to not persuade but evoke? And ultimately, do you think the themes of the story also play a role in the emotional writing?
Yeah, so definitely the genre definitely does affect it. I think in our last interview, we talked a little bit about genre, and I think it would be preferred by probably agents and people in the publishing industry that writers would pick a genre and write to the tropes. And there are certain things that readers expect of certain genres, certainly. But as a writer, just in the creative space, usually, I shouldn't say usually, but often or sometimes it's not the first thing that you think of. So I kind of had an idea that mine was sort of a psychological suspense or thriller in the back of my mind, but I wasn't necessarily writing to try to hit any of the tropes of that genre. I was just trying to write the story. But at some point, you do have to think about and address, what readers expect. And so it's been very interesting to get the feedback for my novel, because the novels that I really love, they are genre bending or cross many genres. They kind of cover a lot of different things. And so people in the reviews, I find it very funny and also love it. But they'll call it all sorts of different things. They'll call it psychological suspense. They'll call it psychological thriller. They'll just call it thriller, gothic. It's been, coming of age, all these different things that I wanted to have in it. But readers, picked up on that. And so that was really fun for me, or really like gratifying, because I wanted to have all of those things. But yeah, within the genres, you have to, I shouldn't say you have to, but it probably would behoove you to know what things readers are expecting. And you might want to consider weaving some of those in, because, if you label something as a romance, and if I had labeled my book, for example, as a romance, and maybe the romance doesn't pan out, people are not going to be happy, and they're going to leave you terrible reviews.
Absolutely. I know that from a good friend of mine who wrote in. Well, this wasn't her fault. This was on the fault of the publisher. They marketed it as a romance fantasy book. It was a fantasy it was a fantasy book that had a romance in it, but it wasn't directly written for that genre. She was torn apart by the reviews, and she actually said on the show she will never again write in that fantasy, in that genre ever again, which you absolutely are right. Writers and authors should have an inkling of, what readers should expect from a book. And ultimately, the author should get an idea of, okay, if I'm writing in this genre, I should keep this in mind. Now, we've talked about so far the things that writers should do when writing emotional scenes and keeping the emotions engaging. Now let's talk about the opposite, the pitfalls. What authors should avoid when writing emotional scenes. Now, Elizabeth, in your opinion, from your journey as an author and from your teachings and from what you've learned as a fellow student as well, what have you learned to be the pitfalls that authors should avoid when it comes to not just writing emotional dialogue or emotional scenes, but just writing in general?
Yeah, well, one of them you mentioned earlier, which is the information dump, where it's very obvious you're reading the story, you might be invested, and then it becomes very obvious at a certain moment that the author is wanting to give a lot of information that you might need as a reader, but they're literally dumping it on the page, and it pretty much immediately pulls you out of this story because there's something about the flow and the rhythm once you as a reader are caught up in this story and it has a certain flow ideally and has a certain rhythm, and then that rhythm suddenly stops because the author felt the need to share some information in a certain way. It really takes you out of the scene. It stops any emotional connection that you had. So that's a really big one. And I think a really easy way of avoiding that is just actually breaking up that information and putting it into different pieces throughout the story. I think it can be really tempting to think, the readers need to know everything about this character. Like, you might have like a full page of backstory on this character, but actually they don't really need to know that. What they need to know are a few salient details about who is this character in this moment. Can they get either maybe like a clear mental image, or they get a sense of how do they speak, can they hear, how is this character speaking? How does this character interact with other characters? Those are some of the really salient details you need in the moment. And if it's a main character and you want to or need to put in information about, how they got to where they are, you don't have to dump all of that in one spot. You can strategically put, a sentence or two throughout different scenes in the book, where it feels more natural and where the reader is not going to feel overwhelmed or feel like, wow, the writer just really needed to get this information in here and they dumped it on the page. So that's one of the big ones, I would say. Yeah.
Absolutely. Very, very true. And there was one other thing that I was going to add to that, which, oh goodness, it's now escaped me. It'll probably come back to me later on. But there was another thing that I did want to ask you, and I think it's probably the most biggest thing when it comes to not just writing emotion and keeping the reader engaged. It's knowing when to trust the reader towards the end, and that is, of course, knowing when a scene or the book is finished, and if those scenes and the overall ending is satisfying for the reader, ultimately going back to when to stop writing. So let's break this down to 3 separate points. So let's start with the first one, knowing when to stop writing. Now, as authors, that's kind of like a difficult thing to do because we can always continually write. But when we look at our own work, we have to not only trust our capabilities, but also trust the reader that they're going to pick up what we are trying to say. So for you, Elizabeth, when you were writing Haggard House, is there a particular chapter in the book that you knew had to come to an end, even though you knew you could continuously write for maybe 2 more pages or so before going on to the next chapter, or even just the overall ending of the book itself?
Yeah, well, I think that the final chapter of the book, I knew how I wanted it to end, but the final chapter, it is quite short, and I did have the temptation to make it longer. I think I had a couple of drafts where it was longer, but realistically, just looking at, again, there's sort of like a natural rhythm and pace. And so once I was in that flow of writing, I kind of knew what the final chapter needed to be very short. And it was just kind of like a little end cap to the story. It gave you just enough information to know, where Adam, the protagonist, head is at in that moment, how he's changed. And I did a lot of research around it, considering because he's in a different location now. And so I did research about that area, what was going on there at that time period. And so again, you have the temptation to, well, I did this research, so it should definitely go in the story because I put a lot of work into it. But in the end, none of that research really went into the story. Maybe a few words at most. And what it came down to is just knowing what the story itself needed, which is very difficult because, as you said, you could continue to tinker forever. But I think it's something that comes with experience, and I'm certainly still, learning that. But you start to get an idea of when is this over. And also one thing that I've noticed, and I think this is analogous to, I used to decorate cakes, and something that I noticed when I was decorating cakes is sometimes the more you messed with it, especially when you're icing a cake and you're trying to get the frosting smooth, there is a certain point at which if you continue to try to smooth it, it actually makes it worse. And so from experience, you learn kind of, okay, what's the point at which I stop? And it's never perfect. There's always some little swirl or, something that you can see, some imperfection, but you get a sense that at some point, my continuing to work on this is going to actually make it worse. And I think that's very similar to writing. Yeah, there's going to be some little imperfections. There's things you could certainly work on, but at a certain point, if you continue to do that, it's actually going to deteriorate the quality of the story.
Absolutely. Now we talk about engagement. I did want to also break down the main characters in Haggard House. As you mentioned in the beginning, there's 5 major POVs in Haggard House. And from your reviewers and the reactions that you've gotten, which of the POVs, in your opinion, was probably the one that got the most engagement? And did you purposely at the time write it so, or looking back on it, was it a different character that you initially wanted to get the most engagement from?
Yeah, so it's interesting because the initial idea for the story, I was thinking more of Penny, who is Adam's love interest in the story. And it was original, again, one of the original drafts, I think was, and also this was written in third person in the original drafts, but it was mostly pretty much exclusively from her point of view. And as I continued to work on this story, I realized there needed to be more of him because he's actually the person who the story ends up being about. And one of my readers, and I guess this illustrates the importance of having people read your work because they're the people who are the readers. I mean, you don't have to have a writer necessarily read your work. At some point you do, because they can point out other types of flaws, but you want to have people that just are, everyday people that don't write, read your story because they will tell you exactly what's wrong with it. They're very good at it. So I had my brother read a bunch of my drafts, but after reading one of the drafts, he said, "Who is this story actually about?" Because I had, there's so many different elements. So you have the 5 different points of view. So it's, in my mind, it was, I said, oh, it's Penny and Adam, like they're the 2 main characters. And he said, okay, but if you had to pick one, which character is this story about? So I had to think about it a little bit, and I was like, it's actually Adam. Because I had thought more about and done more work on Penny's character at that point. So then I had to go back through and work on Adam again. And this is one of the things that's really gratifying about being on the other side of all of that work that goes into the writing process is that in the reviews and comments, I think people most identify with Adam. or maybe not identify, but they definitely feel for him. There's an emotional connection, and Penny too, but I think Adam is the stronger one. And in writing, he was the more difficult character to write. And even when I was finished with the novel, I still wasn't sure I had captured, him in the way that I wanted to. But that's again where the readers come in and they tell you if you did it or not.
Absolutely. And on that topic of finishing, that's another thing I did want to ask you about. Is like the final of these 3 points is, as authors and writers, we need to know when a story is truly finished or when a character's arc is truly finished. And as you mentioned, that there could have been things you would have done a little bit differently for certain characters. Overall, Elisabeth, when did you make the decision to say, I'm done writing Haggard House? This is probably the ending that makes the most sense. And now looking back on it with a clearer perspective, is there anything you would have done differently to either the overall story or one of the major characters in the book?
I think looking back at it, I wouldn't say that there's anything I would do differently. Again, it's kind of the cake example. There are things I could go back and fiddle with. There's certain, details or whatever that aren't perfect. But in my mind, it would be going too far down that road, and maybe I'm going to throw something else off, because you're working with a very finely tuned it's almost like a machine that has all of these cogs and wheels, and they're all interconnected. So if you change something in the story earlier on, you have to make sure it's consistent down the line.
Right.
So it's very difficult to tweak things at a certain point. There are, of course, small details that you could change that wouldn't necessarily affect other parts of the story. But something interesting that happened was I actually thought that the story was done. I mentioned I worked with 2 editors. My second editor was a copy editor, and her name is Katie Schwab. She's an amazing editor. But she looked at it. I thought basically that's all that was left, just copy editing, which is, very small detail type things. And she went through it and she said, I think everything is good as far as the plot and the story, but towards the end, we lose Adam's point of view, because it switched almost fully to Penny's point of view at that point because of the way that the story was structured. And she said, I think we need to know what's going on with him a little bit more towards the end of the book. And I was just that was so difficult for me, because I thought it was done and I hadn't touched this story in, I don't know, many, many months. And I just was so afraid of going back in and like messing with it more. But I knew in my heart of hearts that she was correct. And I thought, okay, well, I'll try it, I'll see what I can do. And I ended up writing 3 more chapters in Adam's point of view and inserting them in different points towards the end of the book. And I'm so, so glad that I did that, because it completely fleshed out the story. Without those 3 last chapters, it would not be the story that it is. It certainly wouldn't be as fully developed as it is, or as I hope it is. And so that was more someone else telling me that, hey, this isn't quite there. And you have to be pretty judicious and listening and being open to other people's feedback. You have to be a bit careful too, but I think you kind of have a sense or an instinct after you've, written for a while of what is and isn't good feedback. And I knew she had good feedback, so I did add those.
Very true. And I think to add on to this, I won't give too many spoilers for this because this is in my current book. But when I was initially writing Decimus, it was originally just 21 chapters. And I thought, okay, book is finished. One of my very long time readers and good friend of mine, Will Solomon, shout out to him, he read it and said, it's good, it's too quick. It needs to be longer. It needs to slow down certain scenes. It's like, okay, I got to rewrite this whole thing. And upon rewriting it, I ended up landed on a book that was 64 chapters long from 21. But in those new chapters, a new storyline kind of emerged that was teased, but I never fully expanded upon. And it involved one of the main characters and the son of the main character kind of having a strained relationship because of a certain scene. And when I initially read it the first time, I was like, oh, shoot, that makes perfect sense that I address this, because almost as what you were talking about before, Elisabeth, how writers and authors talk about a scene and it's like never mentioned again, and readers are like frustrated. It's like, where does this go? Where is this? If you want a reaction, well, you got one, but I'm a little angry because I need to know what happens. And rewriting that scene, it was not easy because I had to think of, okay, what ultimately is going to be the final product. I wanted to still be the same, just as I'm sure you wanted the ending to be the same for Haggard House, even with the new edits and the revisions. It's a very tough decision for authors of using edits to still keep the integrity of the voice, as well as still keeping those same emotions and keeping the reader immersed. I think as a perfect ending to this discussion, Elisabeth, ultimately, at the end of the day, what is like your piece of advice for writers who may be struggling with this one aspect of the writer's journey, writing those emotionally engaging scenes or immersive scenes?
Yeah. So I was looking back through my notes of the workshop that I had with Richard Bausch. I mentioned him a couple times in this. I'm a really bad note taker, so I don't know if this was his direct quote or if he was quoting someone else. So I'm sorry if this is someone else's quote and I'm attributing it to him. It's someone's quote. It's either his or someone else, some other authors. But he just said, how much more horrifying the trickle than the flow. And I thought that was a really good way of thinking about a story and how to structure it for, emotion and getting your readers to feel those emotions. It's what we talked about earlier, avoiding the information dump. It's, slowly, piece by piece, giving the reader information about the characters, information about the story. And if you think about real life relationships, it takes time to build relationships. You meet someone and that's cool, but you're not necessarily invested in them, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then as time goes on, maybe you run into them more. You start to have warmer feelings towards them just because of, proximity. And then maybe you become friends and you piece by piece get information on who they are. You get information on how they act in situations. You get information about their past life. And so I think you want to mirror that in your story because
Right.
it's a steady buildup. It's not a bam, you're going to have an emotional connection with this reader or with this character right away. Although some authors are so good that I would say almost from the first page, you can have that emotional connection. I'm certainly not there yet, but I think just in general, you want to give a trickle of everything. And that's how readers are going to connect with your characters and with your story and get emotionally invested.
Absolutely. Very, very true. And on that note, viewers and listeners, we conclude another amazing episode of the Writers Hub here on Tales from the Wandering Scribe. Want to give a huge thank you to my good friend Elisabeth for coming back on the show. Now, Elisabeth, where can people find and engage with you on social media if they want to reach out and connect, as well as buy copies of your book?
Yeah, well, thank you again for having me. This has been a lot of fun. I really enjoyed our conversation. And yeah, as for connecting with me, there are a couple places you can do that. So I have Substack where I have, newsletters, information about upcoming events with Haggard House, or I'll have an audiobook coming out soon. So that information will be coming out on there. So that's elisabethrhoads.substack.com. I also have a website where you can see more information about me, about the book. That's elisabethrhoads.com. Fairly easy. And I'm also on Instagram and Facebook. I'm sure we can probably put the the call outs in the description. But if you also go to my website, there's the links for all of those social contacts as well.
I'll attach all those down below in the description of this video. If you want to see Elisabeth's first interview, I'll also tag it right here. And furthermore, if you'd like to see Elisabeth and myself in person, well, we have some exciting news. We are going to be tabling at the Orange County Book Festival in November, and that is on November 15th from 10 to 5. That is in downtown Tustin. All the information can be found on the OC Fair Book Fest website on Instagram. Elisabeth will be tabling with her publisher promoting Haggard House. I will be tabling with Mystery Inc. Bookstore promoting Michael, The Gathering, and Son of Persia. So if you would like to meet us in person, that is where we will be. Updates of our specific booths will be coming shortly. So make sure to follow both of us on our social media platforms to stay up to date. And also, we are also going to be at the California Writers Club meeting this Saturday for our annual meetup. So if you'd like to meet us there, we are going to be at the Packing House, and that is from 9 to 11. So if you're a writer and you want to check it out, if you are a storyteller, poet, or just love the written word, come and visit us. It is completely free. It's an amazing place. That's actually how I got involved with the Writers Club. Elisabeth told me about it, and it's been an amazing ever since. So all that and more, I will attach down below. And as always, viewers and listeners, have a wonderful rest of the day. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to stay up to date with all new information. Again, a huge thank you to my dear friend Elisabeth Rhoads for coming back on the show. I wish her the very best on her journey promoting Haggard House, and can't wait to see what she has in store for the rest of us coming next year. Possibly a new story in the works. You never know. But until then, make sure to like, comment, subscribe again. And as always, thank you all so much for your love and support. And we'll see you all in the final 2 episodes releasing on October 30th for a special Halloween. Until then, have a wonderful day, everybody.